sanctions, essentially. So the reason for today's bilateral focus obviously has to do with the much deteriorated situation in Venezuela and European efforts, spurred by the Spanish EU High Representative of Foreign Affairs, to facilitate dialogue through an international contact group and other ways. This webinar is the brainchild of Andrea Arenda and Nelson Dordelio Rosales, who will introduce the debate in just a second. Andrea is a senior research fellow at CEPS, professor at the EUI in Florence, and the leader of a Horizon 2020 project called Trigger, which foresees follow-up events in a series of EU-Latin America relations. I would like to thank Andrea very much for taking this initiative together with Nelson and bringing together a truly stellar set of speakers. I look forward to the debate. First, though, I would like to hand the word over to Nelson Dordelio Rosales, who is a special advisor on foreign affairs of the National Assembly of Venezuela. And as I said, he's been instrumental in the design of this event. Thank you for your cooperation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your welcoming remarks. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for making this event possible, even during these difficult circumstances. Especially Andrea, for your enthusiasm when I first started talking about it. Look at us now, we made it. I hope that this is just the beginning of a series of talks and events on the relationship of the European Union and Latin America, especially Venezuela. Our historic, cultural, political, and economic ties are strong, and we must develop them even further. It is clear that the world is entering into a new phase. Currently, the rule-based international order is under pressure. We have been witnesses to how COVID-19 can affect all of us, and how authoritarians can take advantage to expand and hold a tighter grip on power. Yet, democratic movements across the world are gaining momentum. While the EU is set to establish an EU global human rights sanctions regime to bring accountability to those violating fundamental freedoms. Certainly, the multidimensional crisis in Venezuela must be seen as an opportunity for the EU to fulfill its international role, to foster stability, democracy, and prosperity. I'm sure that we will hear a great discussion today. And now, without further ado, I will turn the time and the floor over to Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks to both Stephen and Nelson. Also, congratulations to Stephen, because this morning CEPS announced something that we knew we knew already since a while, but that is now fully official, that he's been appointed Director of Research at CEPS. So this will give him even more responsibilities, but hopefully Stephen will continue to play his fundamental role also as the head of the foreign policy unit at CEPS. And to Nelson also, that there was really the engine behind this seminar from the very beginning. We in the unit that I lead at CEPS, dedicated to global governance, regulation, innovation, and the digital economy, look at the way in which the EU projects itself in the rest of the world. And this, it's not only something that we look at from the perspective of international relations, but also from the point of view of cooperation on individual policy areas, for example, cooperation on the digital economy, cooperation on regulatory reform. And this is something that's really deepens a little bit the way in which we can look at the relationship between two areas of the world that are so intimately connected, such as the EU and Latin America. And we shared also with Nelson and perhaps with others, I think about Maria Manuel, maybe also Javier Niño Perez, that will be speaking in a few minutes. Also the impression that the deep ties between the EU and Latin America aren't emphasized enough in the agenda, and they should be nurtured over time in a way that helps us to really develop better the way in which the EU and other parts of the world can cooperate together for the greater good and the global good. And this is the reason why we decided to launch not only this seminar, but potentially other seminars in the future that will look at the EU as an actor of global governance and the EU and its relations with other parts of the world. Definitely, we don't know what will be the geopolitical context in which the EU will project its image and its role over the coming months. Perhaps not even Javier, who will take the floor briefly, and who is in charge of Americas for the External Action Service, or Michael, they know anything about who is going to be the next president, although they are the most qualified to tell us from their privileged viewpoint. But I think what will happen over the coming months in the US, in other parts of the world, will also be an important element in order to understand how other players in the global order will be able to cooperate, collaborate, and establish fruitful relations. So today we start with Venezuela. It's a part of the world that has gone through an unbelievable tragedy over the past decades. And of course, over the past few years, the situation in the country has deteriorated further. And COVID-19, even if we're not entirely sure about all the information that flows in from Venezuela to the rest of the world on COVID-19, is one element that has further exacerbated the state of instability and the humanitarian crisis that Venezuela has been experiencing. So without taking any specific political position at this stage on what were the causes of this, at least from our side at CEPS, we wanted just to invite different views and lay down the evidence and the perspectives of different players that are working on the situation of Venezuela. And this is the way in which we want to approach this seminar today. The other thing I wanted to say is that in our research unit, we have almost 20 people right now in the unit that I lead at CEPS. One of them is from Colombia, and this is Monica Rico Benitez. So I've asked Monica to take the lead on this seminar and to moderate and introduce the different speakers. So we're extremely happy that Monica can accept to do this. And I'm sure that the speakers will be in very capable hands for the coming minutes. And then after the speakers will have taken the floor, we will certainly open the floor to participants to collect questions and have at least a few minutes of what I'm sure will be a very lively debate. So I hand over to Monica. Thanks for being moderator today, and thanks to all the speakers for being with us again. See you later.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this presentation. I would like to welcome you all, participants, panelists. I will be moderating this conference, as Andrea has already said. But before starting, I would like to make some preliminary announcements about general practicalities and participating procedures that are important for you to know in order to better guide this discussion. First, this event will be live streamed through the CEPS YouTube channel starting from a few minutes ago. So in case you would like to share it, I will make the link available in the chat. Second, as you have already seen, all participants are muted. So if you have any questions, we invite you to write them through the Q&A tool. The icon should appear at the bottom of your screens. And for those who are attending the event live, we would like to invite you to post on Twitter with the hashtag EUVenezuela. Information on this will also be available in the chat in a few minutes. Once the discussion panel has finished and according to time availability, as Andrea said, questions will be shared to the public and answered by our speakers during the Q&A session. And well, without further ado, I give the floor to our speakers. We will start our panel discussion with Mr. Javier Niño Pérez, Deputy Managing Director for the Americas at the European External Action Service, who recently co-led the EEA Venezuela, and is the leading EU diplomat on the region. So, Mr. Niño, we give you the floor, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Monica, muchas gracias. Truly a pleasure to be with you today. Many thanks to Seps, to Stephen, Nelson, Andrea, and you for organizing this event. Let me just start by echoing what Stephen said. I think this is clearly one of the files that requires that we all remain warm-hearted but cool-headed, because it's a very sensitive and complicated file, and it necessitates that we think strategically and we think carefully about our actions. Somebody, I think it was Andrea, was referring obviously to the, first of all, in terms of the context, the dire economic situation of the country, the dire social situation of the country. This is one of the richest countries in the region, and now we have seen the many challenges that the country is facing economically, socially. 95% of the population roughly without regular access to water, electricity, the dramatic spillover effect to other countries in the region in terms of flow of refugees, the irregular lines of Venezuelans in front of gas stations. So logically, and as you all know, a rather challenging picture from the perspective of the day-to-day life of Venezuelans. And to add obviously to this context, the human rights situation, you will have seen and read recent reports by the High Commissioner on Human Rights. We have in the EU reacted to obviously the human rights situations, and there are a number of Venezuelan officials on the EU sanction list, as you know, and we will obviously continue to monitor the situation in the country, engaging with all actors concerned, including civil society. This is the context. You know this very well as I do. What our assessment of the last 3 months is that we've seen a worsening of the political climate. There were hopes that the regime could be open to the possibility of discussing a more balanced political playing field ahead of the legislative elections. But in our view, the small window of opportunity that there existed for a renewed political process in the emergency context of the COVID pandemic seems to have faded away in our view. The efforts to find space for dialogue that could lead to legislative elections where the opposition, or at least part of the opposition, could take place have not been successful either. And as things stand today, this is our clear view, the elections, the forthcoming elections do not meet the minimum criteria for the EU to be considered free, fair, and democratic. We're also noticing, particularly during the last days and weeks, an increase in the repression of opposition figures, which is particularly worrying ahead of the polls, ahead of the elections. And this could lead, obviously, to the loss of the last national institution standing constitutionally, losing its legitimacy. And this is obviously quite worrying. So this is a rather bleak outlook, the way we see it. And what we strongly feel is that the country necessitates a basic agreement on governance so that we can stop, or the regime can stop the collapse, and the Venezuelans can stop the collapse and rebuild back better, as the saying goes these days. Now, in this context, where do we stand? I think it was Andrea who was referring to the fact, and I think he's right, that we don't pay as much attention as we should to the region. This is probably not the case this is not the case for Venezuela. I think the HRBP has been strongly involved in efforts to facilitate dialogue, as some of you were saying, to pass messages, to try to find areas where there is sufficient agreement to outline a more sustainable political situation in the country. This is in the context of our overall policy in the EU. Our aim, as you know very well, is for a democratic, peaceful stabilization of the country, and to do this to a sustainable political agreement between all parties in Venezuela, because we believe, obviously, that it will have positive benefits not only for Venezuela, but also for the countries in the region. As we speak, this is our assessment, we are possibly the only interlocutor that can talk to all actors, both the regime and the opposition. I was in Venezuela recently, and this is a message that was conveyed to us by all the interlocutors we met. Our value added as the EU remains precisely in that we have access to all interlocutors of all the different areas of the spectrum. And this obviously, just to be framed, and the EU action needs to be framed in the context of the International Contact Group, which we steer. and that brings together, obviously, not only a number of European countries, but also a number of Latin American and Caribbean countries, because we believe, obviously, that those countries should be involved in any effort to facilitate the process of dialogue in Venezuela. So we're deploying significant political efforts, the High Representative personally, we as an institution, and obviously what we're doing is trying to help in those pressing concerns related to migrants, refugees, and to the most pressing humanitarian concerns through ECHO. And in cooperation with a number of member states, we are providing significant levels of humanitarian assistance to the country, and we will continue to do so. Our engagement with the regime, either via humanitarian assistance or politically, is in no way to legitimize the regime, as he has been said sometimes, but it's rather a realistic acceptance of the power dynamics of the reality on the ground. And engaging with the regime is just part of engaging with all political forces and relevant actors, as we do in any other country in the world. This is a geopolitical commission. We want to be an assertive and an effective international policy actor. And this necessitates, not only in Venezuela, but elsewhere, that we engage with all those concerns. And as I said before, beyond the immediate legislative elections, the long-term objective of the EU obviously remains the path to stability, to prosperity, and that will necessitate, in our view, negotiations between all stakeholders concerned in order to find a democratic, peaceful, and sustainable solution to the needs and demands of the Venezuelan people. I'll stop here, and obviously I will be very happy to respond to any questions you might have for me later. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niño, for this very accurate presentation and what has been the EAS mission to Venezuela, what is the European External Action Service work on this issue. We will now hear Mr. Michael Grant's intervention, Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas at Global Affairs Canada. So, Mr. Grant, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Monica, and good morning from Canada. Good afternoon, buenos dias, bonjour à tous. First, I'd like to thank CEPS for inviting me to participate. I found it kind of interesting that you reached out to a Canadian to speak at a conference looking at EU-Venezuela relations, but it's my pleasure to offer a few comments and really to benefit myself from this very important conversation. Thank you as well, Andrea, and Nelson and Stephen. And to Javier and the other panelists. It's great to see some of you. Javier and I have been kind of working together, but we've never met in person. At least maybe we have in a previous meeting, but it's kind of interesting, the world we're living in these days. So I really appreciate CEPS bringing this together, because it's a very, very important issue. You know, when I first started thinking about it, I thought about the role of Canada and EU in the world, because we do cooperate in many, many places. And we do so because we share the same values of democracy, the values of human rights. And it's really on that basis that we engage, whether it's in Venezuela or in anywhere else. Very recently, the Prime Minister Trudeau met with the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Union Council, and reconfirmed exactly that is the basis of Canada and the EU cooperating in the world. And Venezuela was one of the issues that they discussed. So looking at the situation, I certainly don't want to repeat what we've heard already and what we've seen in some of the background documents, but the situation in Venezuela is clearly dire, and it's dire from many different perspectives. I think one thing, and you may hear me say this a couple of times today, is for us, when we look at the current situation in Venezuela, we have to recall the origins. And the origins are very much the robbing of democracy and human rights of the Venezuelan people by the Maduro regime. That is the genesis of the situation that we're in today, whether it is the political situation or the economic situation. And until democracy is fully restored to Venezuelans, we will not be able to fully assist in helping Venezuela achieve a return to economic prosperity and full respect for human rights. So I won't mention the statistics, but in terms of the number of Venezuelans that are currently in poverty, the GDP, the number of Venezuelans that have fled the country. But what I will say is, I would love to be able to say that after a few years of working on this from the international community perspective, that we can see progress. We can't. And frankly, I think, to speak honestly, Venezuela is further from democracy or respect for human rights than it has ever been. And that is the real backdrop to where we are now, and looking towards the elections that are scheduled in December. I think I can only agree with Javier that from where we sit, there are no conditions to allow for free and fair elections. And this is something that Canada and its partners in the Lima Group have also said very clearly. When we talk about that, I think it's important to remind ourselves sometimes, what are those conditions? What are those basic conditions necessary for free and fair elections, whether it's in Venezuela or anywhere else? But in the Venezuelan context, we need full independence of all political parties. We need to end any persecution on political leaders, members of the legislature, their staff, their family. We need to ensure voter registration is completely up to date. We need to ensure a independent national electoral council. I would add an independent Supreme Court as well. Impartial election observation, and all of the mechanics that go along with carrying out elections, as well. Complete media freedom. And I think of all of those things I've just mentioned, none of them exist in Venezuela. So the conclusion of all of us that the conditions don't exist is pretty obvious. So what does that mean we should do? What's the conclusion? Well, as sometimes frustrating as it may be, we need to redouble our efforts to ensure that we are speaking with a unified international voice to demand that those conditions be put in place. It is not easy, it is not quick, but it is exactly what we need to do. And again, here's where I repeat myself, but we are focused on December the 6th, but we cannot lose sight of what has happened over the last 7 years. Maduro won a legitimate election in 2013, from our perspective, and I think everyone's perspective. But since then, the actions of him and his regime have eroded any form of democracy in Venezuela. And until that is completely restored, including through legitimate presidential elections, Venezuelans will not see their democratic rights fully restored, and our work won't be done. So this discussion is about the future. So looking forward, what can we do, and how can Canada, its partners in the hemisphere, work with Europe, work with the European Union, and with others? I think first and foremost, looking at the short term, we will continue to be guided by Venezuelan constitution and Venezuelan law. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional expert, so I rely on that advice, and I'm sure there are others out there who can speak more informed than I. But following the elections that will likely take place in a fraudulent way, we will look to the interim government of Juan Guaido, the legitimate National Assembly, to see what the next steps will be. And from a Canadian perspective, we will look to those legitimate actors for a guide on the way forward. I think it's clear that the forces of democracy in Venezuela will need more support than ever before. And that includes moral support, it includes ensuring their voice is heard within Venezuela and without. And from an international point of view, and again, this goes to kind of Canada and the EU traditionally working together to support democracy and human rights, I think it's important to engage other players in the international community who also believe in that. And it's interesting, in the last year or more in the Americas, we have had some very tense political and situations and elections. Guyana is an example, Bolivia is an example, and there's a lot to debate within those, but I think at the core of what we saw come through in those processes was a belief in democracy, a belief in freedom of speech, and a belief in legitimate political processes. And I think that applies as much to those places as it does to Venezuela. And so I look at those countries, including many in the hemisphere, and Javier mentioned the Caribbean, who were so vocal in speaking up on Guyana. We need to see the same in speaking up on Venezuela. And I think that is at the first of our to-do list of how we can work together, is engaging those countries who really believe in democracy. I think when I look at cooperation, whether it's on Venezuela or others, but we're speaking of Venezuela, I think the first thing I would say, there's no competition. There's no supreme role for one region or the other, or one country or the other. We all have a very important role in this, but we need to be working completely together. I think from a Canadian perspective, I've enjoyed very much the engagements with the EEAS, and I know my political leaders have enjoyed engaging with the leaders in the EU. I think it's very important that as we move forward, and I'm not saying we have the exact same points of view on every single subject, that's a possibility, but we do have at the core that belief in democracy. I think there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of the collaboration and coordination of the various groups in the various countries that are engaged on this. There's no monopoly, and I think we all have something to add. And that's exactly the point of view that we look at moving forward. In terms of the focus, we've talked about the political process and taking a firm stance, engaging with those countries that believe in democracy in the hemisphere and in the world. But at the same time, we need to increase our efforts on the humanitarian situation. The plight of Venezuelans within Venezuela has not received sufficient attention. And I'd say that from our perspective and from others, that is something that we are looking at increasing, and we need to do better. I think the role of the UN is very important in this regards, and its agencies. One that we work with, within the UN family is PAHO, and especially at this time of COVID. This is very nonpartisan, apolitical work, and we need to step up our efforts. But the same goes for the humanitarian situation of Venezuelans that have fled Venezuela. And Javier mentioned the very important work the EU has been doing. Canada has been trying as well. We have recently taken over the coordination of the donor process, and we're looking forward to a significant conference likely in the spring. But along the way, we will be doing a lot of work here and also in the region to support the Venezuelan migrants, but also those countries that have opened up their arms so warmly. So this needs to be a focus. As we move forward, we cannot lose sight of accountability. And it's been mentioned, the fact-finding missions report. This is a very important work, and it's really just at the beginning. We will be taking a hard look at how to utilize all levers within the UN system to ensure that human rights abuses are brought to light and accountability is achieved. This is not going to be easy. This is exactly an area where I think we see completely eye to eye wherever you sit in the world. and it's where we need to focus. The last thing I'll mention is on recovery. We can't lose sight of that as well. Over the last couple of years, there was a lot of work done primarily by the government of interim President Guaido on Plan País. A lot of very useful research and conversations at the IDB, for example. This is an area where we've committed. I know your EU is committed as well. And it's important to remind ourselves of that, because this will not be an easy recovery. And it's important that Venezuelans see the commitment of the international community to assist. And sometimes when we're dealing with these very important short-term issues, it's easy to lose sight of that important big picture. So let me just conclude, again, being a little bit repetitive, but from a Canadian perspective, I'll say this clearly. The international community is not going to solve Venezuela. Venezuelans need to solve this crisis, but we have to help. And the best way that we can help is working together in a tight, collaborative way, speaking as much as we can with one voice. And that's the approach that Canada wants to see, and where we will be redoubling our efforts. So thank you again. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. I think your intervention very well presented and collected the common ground upon which the European Union and Canada, and I believe most interested stakeholders in the Venezuelan crisis stand to face the situation. I think we're doing very good with time, and we know Mr. Nino Perez should leave sooner than we expected. So we will be addressing questions from the public that fit really well with the previous presentations. So the first one is from Eva from Save the Children to Mr. Javier Nino Perez. And she asks, it's of course a pity EU will not observe the upcoming elections in Venezuela. Could you please explain more about the minimum requirements not being met? When it comes to not enough time argument, EU managed to prepare and send the observers to Bolivia with even less time. So, Mr. Nino, we give you the floor.
Thank you, Monica. Let me try to explain this in the most possible simplistic way, because it's a very technical matter. We could not possibly deploy an electoral observation mission to Bolivia because those kind of missions necessitate preparatory work, and the timeline of that preparatory work is roughly 5 to 6 months. Since the elections are taking place on the 6th of December, it would have been impossible for us to do so. That was that is a context in which our political director and I traveled to Venezuela a few weeks ago. Our mission had as an objective to request the government for an extension of the elections by 5 or 6 months, so that the EU could actually deploy that electoral observation mission. But the response we got from the government was that it was not possible to postpone the elections, or that they didn't intend to. And in that context, we simply reiterated the impossibility for the EU to send that electoral observation mission.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nino. There's another question for Mr. Grant from Zain de Ponte. We have other questions that keep coming. I would just like to tell participants that they will be further addressed. But we will just take this very last question. We will move forward with some presentations that are going actually to be addressing some of your points. And afterwards, we will certainly be sharing your questions with the whole public. So, Mr. Grant, Zain de Ponte says, thanks for this interesting discussion. My question, there has been an exodus of Venezuelans leaving their country in the past 5 years, leaving to mostly neighboring Colombia and Brazil, but also small islands in the region, including Aruba, where I am from. What can and should the EU and Canada do to help these people, whether they are migrants or refugees? I leave to the panelists' analysis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question, and it's something that we're focusing a lot of time and effort on. First, as I mentioned earlier, Canada appreciates so much what neighboring countries have done in welcoming Venezuelan migrants. Even before the pandemic, the economic situation in many of these places was tough, and to accept Venezuelans the way that all of them have is really, it's incredible and it's heartwarming. I think our approach has been to see where we can help best those countries in providing the services that they're committed to do, whether it's health or education or housing. And I think as much as we can, working in a coordinate way through the international system is very important. It is difficult when you look at the magnitude, and so we also have to be as innovative as we can. Canada has championed mechanisms, for instance, the Global Concessional Financing Facility through the World Bank to allow Colombia and now Ecuador to access resources to allow them to do just that. That's vital. At the same time, we need to work as well with civil society, especially those NGOs advocating on behalf of migrants, civil society of migrants themselves, to ensure that they have the services that they need and that includes respect for human rights and as well to ensure that their situation it does not become worse wherever they may be. But the most important thing that the international community can do to assist Venezuelan migrants is to assist in finding a solution to the crisis in Venezuela. I think the commonality of those Venezuelans that have taken such a difficult decision to leave is that they want to return. And the best way that Canada and others can help is to do everything we can to find a solution. And that means a return to democracy, a return to respect to human rights, an economy on its feet and moving forward. So we do need to take care of short-term needs, but the best solution is a full return to democracy in Venezuela. Thank you.
Mr. Grant, thanks a lot for your answer. We will now move forward with MEP Maria Manuelita Marquez intervention. So MEP, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thank you to the SEPs and to Andrea Renda in particular for this invitation to participate in this debate so difficult on a very difficult situation. It's my pleasure to be here with you discussing this topic. This has been discussed numerous times in the Parliament. We had 13 resolutions on Venezuela in 5 years, and even great number of debates without resolution. However, we seldom discuss the EU strategy for Venezuela. Most times we have been using Venezuela as a tool for political fights, even national ones, in the European Parliament, and not working together to help Venezuela free itself from the difficult situation it is in. And today will not be the case, and thus I'm excited to be here having this constructive discussion, and I hope it inspired me to my work in the European Parliament. Let me tell you before addressing Venezuela that this is also the case for other Latin American countries with better situation than Venezuela case. And it's urgent to correct this dynamic in the European Parliament and trying to promote a more positive agenda for Latin America. In my case, of course, a progressive agenda, obviously, but nonetheless, one that tries to move EU-Latin American relation into the future instead of being stuck reacting to immediate events. And what does it mean? Well, the European Union and Latin America are extremely close, as someone told before me, culturally and historically. I think it was Nelson, and probably the closest region of the world. And Latin America and the EU, for instance, are facing two difficult transition, the green and the digital transitions. We are dealing with these problems in order both Latin America and the EU are trying that those transitions be done without left people behind, increasing inequalities instead of reducing them. And so Latin America and the EU are also facing this difficult situation resulting from pandemic. According to ECLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, the region will experience a 9.1% fall in GDP in 2020. And also the number of people living in poverty will rise by 45.4 million in 2020, a figure that represents 37% of Latin American population. So also the COVID-19 crisis impacts Latin America in the midst of the largest migration crisis of its history. Between 2016 and 2019, almost 4.5 million Venezuelans left the country. And at the same time, thousands of people left Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador for Mexico and the US, and from Nicaragua to Costa Rica and Panama. And the problem of migrants is particularly difficult to solve, since many of them live in precarious homes and sanitary conditions. And this is also a big problem in this situation of pandemic. So we really need a positive cooperation between Latin America and Europe. And there's a lot we can do together concerning digital transition and concerning green transition, but that can be the topic of another debate in CEPS. I hope so. Today we are here to discuss the situation of Venezuela. And let me start by stating what should be of common agreement. I hope so. A military intervention will not solve anything. This is a red line for me. Only suffering and a bloodbath can result from it. And I myself will never forget September 1973 in Chile, the day when it rained in Santiago. So diplomacy is the way forward. Of course, we can be frustrating because we have been trying to restore democracy and rule of law in Venezuela for so long now, but it really is the only way. Seeing the terrible conclusion in the recent report of Michelle Bachelet on human rights violation makes us desperate to change the situation and do it quickly. But we cannot lose the sight of the real possibilities of doing it. So right now, we still have an opposition in Venezuela, in the parliament, but the time is running out. The 6th December election do not give any guarantee of being free and fair, but will most likely happen. With that, Maduro regime will undermine the legitimacy of the opposition, despite not winning any legitimacy for himself. Thus, we end up worse than we are before the election, we need to recognize. But is there an alternative? Borrell and the European Union, and we support them, have been fighting for a postponement that, combined with a certain condition of political freedoms for the opposition, and it could make things better. This is also the position of this was also the position of the International Contact Group, but unfortunately, they didn't succeed in this visit to Venezuela. So we have no option but to push Maduro to a hold fairer and freer election. The economy is very damaged. Oil price is not recovering soon. He will need help from the international community and may be willing to open up a bit. But what should be our strategy with the opposition? From my point of view, it's important that the opposition remains united. It's interesting to see opposition take advantage of the opportunities of the Constitution, organizing this popular consultation, which starts December 5th, but we don't know what will happen after the consultation. I remind the situation in Portugal and in Spain, but I remind better Portugal, of course, during the authoritarian regime before 1975. Elections were never free or fair, but the opposition always participate, taking advantage of the opportunities. It's a way to show up, to show our citizens we have not given up, that they have an alternative in the near future. We don't know if the future is near or not, but we're trying to do our best in order to democracy. So at the end of the day, there is little light at the end of the tunnel. We need to recognize, and all the participants in this debate is terrible for all of us. But we must keep pushing Maduro, support the civil society, pushing the sanctions against people as the European Union are doing instead of sanctions against citizens is the best we can do. The EU is one of the last international partners to speak to every party in this conflict, and this is a very important capital. Be able to speak to every part in the ground. We must not jeopardize that. On the contrary, we must use it towards the restoration of democracy and rule of law in Venezuela, and of course, better lives for the Venezuelans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, for your intervention. I would like to share both with our speakers and to our attendees that we are receiving very interesting questions. We are very happy about this. We will just move forward with Ambassador Arria's intervention, and afterwards we will be addressing some of your questions before the final intervention from Dr. Jorge Guzman. So I will give the floor to Ambassador Arria, and afterwards we'll go with some more questions. Thank you very much. Ambassador Arria, could you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
I was thanking all of you for having invited me. I see by the audience today reminds me of the General Assembly of the United Nations by its diversity. At the time when we were a free country and we were promoting the best causes of humanity, human rights, which is absolutely the opposite of today's realities. You know, I would like to provide a disclaimer. I do not belong to any political party in my country. I'm not looking for any job in my country, and I do not work for any commercial economic interest group, nor in my country, nor anywhere. You know, when I received this invitation, that Nelson was the first one to tell me of the future of Venezuela. I was about to tell him, listen, Nelson, you should precede the future of Venezuela and the role of the European Union with a question mark. And I said, why? Because we really do not have the luxury to think of the future. I am very thankful for what the previous speakers have stated on my country, which actually have preempted many of the things I would have liked to say to you. But I cannot lose the opportunity to center my concerns basically on a few points that have to do with the nature of the monster. And which is a monster? You know, I keep listening many fora that we should look at the Chilean transition, the Spanish transition, even the Portuguese transition, but none of those countries have narco presidents in charge of them. That was not the situation in Portugal. The Chilean armed forces were not narco traffickers, even less in Spain. So what really we are faced today is a sort of the continuity in living in denial of what we, the Venezuelans, face. I have been, when I was a member of the United Nations Security Council, on the other side of the issue, having to do with the Rwandans, with the Somalis, with the Bosniaks, Muslims in the Balkans. And I learned very quickly that there is a different sense of time between the negotiators and the victims. I speak to you today as a victim, not as a negotiator. So it is difficult to ask us, the Venezuelans, to think of the future and to be cool-headed and to wait, and this will take a long time. You know, I would not have the heart to tell the people who are in the hospitals in Venezuela dying because of lack of medicine, and what was the wealthiest country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, really, that we have to wait. So the sense of timing works differently for the people who are in the international community and for the people who are suffering the consequences in Venezuela. You know, we have the biggest diaspora in the history of Latin America, 20% of our people, not because they didn't like the country. No, we're a country of immigrants. We have become a country of immigrants because we do not have a government. We have, and this is what I would like to center my words to you, is a narco-criminal corporation who has taken over the country. I give an example. Pablo Escobar was never president of Colombia. Chapo Guzman was never president of Mexico, even though there were some of the biggest drug dealers in the world. In Venezuela, Maduro is the president of Venezuela. And Cabello is the president of the National Assembly. Both of them accused as narco traffickers. And even the US Treasury have put a ransom of $15 million to deliver Mr. Maduro. So no one have dealt in a situation like ours. I am very thankful for all the recognition that we get all over the world or some of the countries, but no one can tell us exactly what to do, not even ourselves, because no one has dealt with a narco regime in control of a country like we are facing today in Venezuela. And if you deal with a narco regime, you cannot all the time resort to the constitution. Narco criminals corporations do not have constitutions. Narco criminals do not have electoral processes. Narco criminal corporations do not participate in elections. So if the international community really wants to help us, you must start rethinking again, how is the approach to something of this nature, of the nature of this monster, like I am telling you without any kind of exaggeration. You know, I am probably very much affected from what I saw in Europe during the former Yugoslavia war, in which I remember the same kind of speeches toward, let's negotiate, let's keep a cool head, everything will be solved, but we have to do it diplomatically. And it took 3 years. And in 3 years, they killed 200,000 people, violated 20,000 women, and using the ethnic cleansing, moved 2 million people of their homes. You know, I wouldn't like to see people from the European Union in the future having to write a paper like Kofi Annan had to do after the Balkans War, which is a sort of a confession, saying we were wrong, we did not understand the nature of the monster. It was a dark page because we underestimated the capacity to do damage that these people had. I am hoping that people will not commit the same thing and have to repeat the same things. Today in Europe, unfortunately, we're beginning to see the reaction of extremists. I am finishing a book called A Room Without a View, because that's the Security Council. And in June 4th, 1993, I gave a speech and I said to the European countries mainly, if you continue to live in denial of the situation for the Muslims in the middle of Europe, you are going to promote that the most radical Islamists move into the area and will generate terrorist actions. Unfortunately, it is happening. And it's happening not only there, it's happening to all of us as a consequence of living in denial of what the reality was. The reality at the time justified other means. For example, I read with great interest Javier Niño's paper, and I heard him, and I agree with him. But when you hear that we have to find democratic ways to deal with a criminal corporation, a mafia corporation, I have to ask the people of the assembly, how do you do that? How could you face such a situation? I don't believe that diplomacy is the most adequate way to handle the issue. At the same time, I understand the reluctance of the use of force, which I agree to. But for example, what could the European Union do is one of the questions that Monica sent me. I believe that to increase sanctions to individuals who are in Europe today linked to the government of families of the government members should be imposed. For example, today in Spain, we have many of those people who have enriched themselves stealing from the Venezuelan regime and helping them living in Spain, the same living in Dominican Republic, but that's other parts of the world. And my last comment on that have to do, Venezuela is in the Americas. What do I mean with this? That the Organization of American States should play an important role in defining the options if we want to have a future to talk about. The United Nations Security Council is blocked to us as a courtesy of Russia and China. So that's an avenue that we cannot travel, but we could travel with the European Union working in tandem with the Organization of American States. I tell you something, I am extremely thankful. And when I hear that there is great interest in Venezuela, at one time I was the Minister of Information and Tourism of my country. And that's what I always wanted, interest in my country, in our people, in our beaches, and our mountains. Today, unfortunately, I tell you, it's become a very painful exercise for me to talk about the tragedy of my country. Thank you.
Ambassador Ria, thank you very much. Your intervention has been very interesting and actually quite accurate, both to answer a few questions that we've received from our attendees and to later on introduce the intervention from Jorge Guzman, who is also addressing some international and global views of the Venezuelan situation. So first of all, we'd like to share with you some questions related to your intervention and also addressed to MEP Maria Manuelita Marquez. I'll read them together in order to better take advantage of time. And afterwards, I'll give you the floor to answer these questions. So, our invitee says, to the panel, in a military dictatorship where a single non-democratic political actor holds a monopoly to arms, how can Venezuelans begin to build a democratic system?
Could you go a little bit slower?
Of course. Sorry if I went too fast there. So the question is, how can Venezuelans begin to build a democratic dictatorship where a single non-democratic political actor holds a monopoly to arms? So first question. The second question says, thanks so much to the panelists and organizers for discussing the Venezuelan crisis. As Venezuelan living in Brussels, I share the idea that we Venezuelans should solve the Venezuelan crisis. Nonetheless, my concern is that political and democratic spaces have been closing, e.g. our political leaders in jail, exile, no conditions for democratic election, concentration of power, humanitarian crisis affecting the population, now with the added effects of COVID. So the question is, how can we Venezuelans solve this? We have as well the question from Roland Pinto, who asks, what is going to be the EU's position towards a potential illegally elected new Venezuelan parliament? Is the EU will the EU continue to recognize Guaidó as the interim president of Venezuela after December? And well, this makes already quite a lot, but I will read the latest of the questions that we've received because it is specifically addressed to MEP Maria Manuelita Marquez. The question says, I am Venezuelan and I do see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. What I see though is that the international understanding of what happens in our country is rather disappointing. And I believe the reason is that we try to explain what is happening in Venezuela with what has happened in other countries before, without the understanding that it is a very special situation, criminals ruling an influential country. So the question is, how do you see the process of pushing Maduro to go into democratic elections? We need to point out that they have been under sanctions for a long time now, mostly from the US. Also, they do have international cooperation. Unfortunately, it happens to be with countries like Iran or Turkey. So these are the questions. They were mainly addressed to MEP Maria Manuelita Marquez, to Mr. Grant, I would say as well. And I think that Mr. Nino could also have a word to answer these questions. So I would like to give 1 minute to each our panelists to address these questions. I would like to start with MEP. Please, MEP, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all participants and thank you for the questions. So there are difficult questions, I understand. First of all, from my opinion, you cannot accept the results of elections, the elections without conditions to be free. As Javier Nino said before, elections without an independent observation, elections without update of registrations, elections without a free independent body or court to control the process and to control that is transparent and fair, and of course elections with persecution of the opposition cannot be free, fair and the results are not acceptable. This is, of course, my position on the matter. Of course, no doubt, I'm not Venezuelan. I'm not living there, and this is very different. I know. From my history myself is also very different, but as you know, we are very worried with situation in Venezuela, not only in the European Parliament, but also in Portuguese government, because we have a great community of Portuguese people or originary Portuguese people in Venezuela. So we follow the situation very close. And so if you want me to say that I'm in favor of an external military intervention to solve the problem, my answer is no at the moment. My answer is no doubt about that. And I'm not comparing Chile situation and Cuba situation and other situations. I totally agree. I know I studied the history of these countries and the situation. There are different situations, but I am against the military intervention because I think at the end of the day it will be a bad result. What I would like to know from some of the participants, what is the position of the army, Venezuelan army, in this context? Can you give some more information on that? I'm sorry to end with a question myself, but this is a debate and can be useful also to discuss this critical point, for my point of view, a very critical point in this, to understand the situation in Venezuela and to understand how we are, we didn't find a solution until now. We haven't found a solution until now. Thank you.
Once we receive the answers from our public, we will be surely sharing them. We move forward to Mr. Grant, please. 1 minute to answer the questions.
Thanks very much, Monica. Let me just try and answer this very quickly. I think in terms of how do Venezuelans move forward, to find a solution, it's not an easy answer and it's not an easy situation. But I think for the international community, what we can do is, as much as possible, help to create that political space, support those actors who believe in democracy and believe in the rule of law, to make sure that all Venezuelans see that from the international community. I think that's essential. As I said, and Javier and others, the international community must be clear that we will not accept fraudulent electoral processes. This has to be spoken loudly and repeated. We have to build that international support for democracy. As I mentioned, some of those countries that have been very clear of the importance of following proper democratic processes in other countries, they should also be speaking up on Venezuela. We have to maintain pressure. We've talked a little bit about sanctions regime. It's something that Canada has had. But the key message on that, and this goes a little bit to the message for, say, in the military leaders, is a clear message to those that there will be accountability and they need to consider their actions. Canada as well believes this needs to be a peaceful transition, that a military intervention is the worst case scenario. And then, as I mentioned, the other thing that we can do is to make clear that we are in this for the long-term support and full recovery of Venezuelans' democracy and economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we finally receive Mr. Nino's answer. Please, you have the floor. Mr. Nino, could you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Now, let me just echo what Michael and Maria Manuel said about how we see the process. Michael says something very important, and that is that at the end of the day, we have to keep in mind that the solutions for Venezuelan problems need to be found by Venezuelans themselves and not by external actors. And in that context, I would like to refer to recent studies that show that 60% of Venezuelans, a large majority of Venezuelans, want a peaceful dialogue and negotiation and solution to this process. And as it has been said, not unilateral solution, and obviously even less military intervention. We think that would be extremely negative. As Michael and Maria Manuela Sueco, our view is crystal clear. If the elections take place in the conditions that we actually have on the table, we will not consider those elections free and fair, and we will not recognize, obviously, the assembly emerging from those elections. And just one final point on how the EU, how High Representative Borrell views diplomacy. We believe that, and Borrell believes very strongly that he is willing to engage and talk to any actor that is capable of helping achieve progress and dialogue in any given country. And this applies to Venezuela as to any other country in the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niño. We are now sharing some more questions, but actually we will be sharing them as an introduction to Jorge Guzman's intervention. Jorge, please take attentive note from the questions that I will be sharing just now, because I think they're quite accurate to receive your presentation. So we have a Roland Pinto question. He says, it's well known how much fleeing Venezuelans struggle. I'm sorry, I apologize. I was reading the wrong question. It's actually Peter Shrey. We'll be addressing that question further on. Just one moment. I will ask one moment to our attendee. We'll receive the question from Peter Schrager. I'm sorry for the pronunciation of the surname. So it says, Russia and China have vested interests in Venezuela. What possibilities does the European Union and the international community have to influence the support the Maduro government gets from these countries? From Peter as well, he asks, Evo Morales just went from Argentina to Venezuela before going back to Bolivia. How do you see Venezuela's Maduro's influence on other countries in Latin America? We have Alexander's question, who asks, which influence in either direction would you say other Latin American countries, Chile, Brazil, may have? What correlation would there be with the degree to which those countries are confronted with migrants from Venezuela? And finally, Alvaro's Amado question, who says, there's an important comparison that has not been brought up about the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. Brookings has published a paper describing how the Venezuelan refugee crisis is said to become the largest and most underfunded crisis in modern history, where the international community has spent just $580 million 4 years into the crisis. When comparing on a per capita basis, this translates into $1,500 per Syrian refugee and $125 per Venezuelan refugee. The international community has largely been able to ignore this scaling catastrophe by labeling it as a regional crisis, not yet one of global scope. What can be expected in the near future, and how can the funding be escalated towards increasing aid for both migrants and Venezuelans who remain in the country? So maybe I will give some context to attendees about Jorge's profile, because I have not yet presented him. Jorge is a PhD in political science with a specialization in global politics, and he's former advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia and former advisor to the Ambassador of Colombia in Venezuela. So he has both the global perspective that is needed to address these questions and the regional perspective. Jorge, having said that, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Monica. First of all, I would like to thank CEPS for this invitation. To the other panelists, it's an honor to share with you today. To Andrea, of course, to Nelson, and Monica. And also, I would like to thank all the audience to take the time to join us today. So these questions are very specific and very focused in what I already have prepared to talk to you today. I would like to address two specific points from the perspective of the analysis of global politics. The first one is from a neoliberal institutionalism perspective regarding the necessity of cooperation to support the Venezuelan migration to the humanitarian crisis. And the second point that I would like to talk today is from a realist perspective, highlighting the analysis of Venezuela as a geopolitical interest for the global power states. So regarding the first point, the necessity of international cooperation, I would like to describe the current context and give you some statistics so you can notice the situation that is living right now Venezuela. So the migration from Venezuela is the second largest in the world nowadays. Syria is the first. 5.5 million Venezuelans have left the country. The population of Venezuela is around 28 million, if I remember well. Venezuela is a failed state. We already know that. It's a failed state. People is leaving Venezuela because of the social and economic conditions. 90% of the population in Venezuela is in poverty, and 2/3 of the population cannot eat 3 times a day. During the pandemic, more than 1 million migrants came back to Venezuela because of the lack of opportunities that countries such as Colombia has offered because of the shutdown. And now we are seeing that there is a second wave of migrants that are starting to come to Colombia and other countries in Latin America since 2 months ago. Colombia authorities estimated that 80% of Venezuelans who returned to their country during the pandemic are returning with an additional person. That means that this second wave is going to be big as it was the first wave. Even before the pandemic that brought negative socioeconomic consequences to Latin American countries, the international community has not supported enough this humanitarian crisis. And I would like to notice that. According to broken institutions, while Rohingya has received $343 per migrant, Colombia has only received $42 per migrant. This amount is extremely low comparing also with Syria, who has received $290 per migrant, and south of Sudan, who has received $120 per migrant. So with this first point, which is the humanitarian crisis for a neoliberal institutionalism perspective and the necessity of cooperation, what should the role of the European Union? I believe that the European Union role should continue supporting the receptors countries such as Colombia, financing more aids to attend the humanitarian crisis, developing socioeconomic projects for the migrants and the receptor communities, and to strengthen the migration institutions in Colombia. I would like to highlight that it is very important to develop socioeconomic projects for the migrants, but those projects should address not only the Venezuelan migrants, but also the receptor communities. In that way, we can build the coexistence. Colombia and Venezuela has very strong cultural roots, and we are like brothers, so the coexistence is not difficult at all. And we need to pay attention to xenophobia too, to stop any kind of xenophobia in the receptor countries. In addition, I believe it's highly recommendable that the European Union should support Latin America, sensitizing and socializing the international community with the current humanitarian crisis and developing a global fundraising strategy. A fund to diminish poverty and inequality. And within this big topic of poverty and inequality, you can address also some solutions to attend the humanitarian crisis for Venezuelans. Latin America has suffered the socioeconomic consequences of the COVID-19, of course. During the last 10 years, 60 million people have left poverty in Latin America. So Latin American countries were working well, diminishing poverty and inequality. We should do in a better way, but we were doing well. But because of the COVID-19, 46.4 million people will return to poverty in Latin America. So poverty, inequality, and the humanitarian crisis of Venezuela are big issues that we need cooperation. Regarding the second topic that I would like to address from a realist perspective, which is the geopolitical analysis, I would like to say that Venezuela has become a high interest issue for global powers talking about balance of power. China has increased its presence in Latin America in the last decades. Total China-Latin American trade increased from $17 billion in 2002 to almost $315 billion in 2019. China is the second most important trade partner for the region, and is the first commercial partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. Chinese banks, such as China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank, have become the largest lenders in Latin America. China's economic goals in the region include securing access to oil, minerals, and agricultural goods. In the tragedy of great power politics, Mearsheimer, who is the most relevant realist alive, criticized the US, the United States, for doing anything to stop the continuing increased presence of China in Latin America. The US and Latin America have had a hegemonic relation, as we already know, and I think Mearsheimer was not wrong. But I also think that it has changed during the Trump administration. I strongly believe that Venezuela became more important for the US because Trump used the current situation to send a message to China to stop its increasing presence in Latin America. The personal sanctions against Maduro and his near circle are good strategy to try to end the current authoritarian regime in Venezuela, but it is not enough. A possible way to support the transition to a democratic stage, beginning with fair, transparent, and verifiable presidential elections, is negotiating with China, Russia, and in a less measure with Iran to end their support to the current authoritarian regime of Maduro. These supports at what is maintaining Maduro in power. I have no doubt about it. Therefore, the role of the European Union is to form a new coalition with Latin American governments and Canada in order to negotiate separately with these three countries, stopping their economic and military support to Venezuela. I think that will be the start of the end of Maduro regime. Regarding the US presidential elections, we are already looking forward who's going to be the next president. And I strongly believe that if Trump's continuing the power, is going to be the same foreign policy against multilateralism and focus more on bilateral relations. But on the other hand, I believe that if Biden will be the next president, I think that the foreign policy of the US will recover part of that multilateralism and that could also make a difference in this situation. Final thought. The recent history of Venezuela can be divided before and after former President Hugo Chavez and Maduro. I had the opportunity to work at the Embassy of Colombia in Caracas from 2002 to 2006. During this time, I realized that Chavez was not the cause of what he called the socialism of the 21st century. He was the consequence. And I'm saying the consequence because the Fourth Republic, which was called the South Arabia of South America in that time because of the oil boom in the 1970s, did not invest the oil utility to diversify the economy and to reduce inequality in Venezuela. Therefore, they create the best scenario possible for a populist leader such as a Chavez. I'm saying this because it is time to think the European Union and Latin American countries. We need to start planning how to support also the transition in Venezuela and support technically the recovery of the institutions, fighting against the current poverty and the misery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I think that we pretty much addressed the questions that with which we introduced your presentation. We have a few minutes left to conclude. We unfortunately are not going to be able to address some questions that are left from our public. But I think it would be important to ask our panelists if they have questions to answer between themselves, because some of you addressed points that were mentioned by the others, but we haven't really had the time to build the interaction between yourselves. So if right now there's anyone who is willing to intervene and create this dialogue between speakers, please, Mr. Grant, I see you're willing to share some thoughts, so I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Monica. And I want to follow up on something Jorge said in terms of engaging with those supporters of the Maduro regime. I completely agree. And I think when I look at international efforts, those of Canada, the Lima Group and others, I think it has been a bit of a failure, to be honest. And I think there's much more that can be done. Are we going to convince these governments to see the light and change their ways tomorrow? Probably not. But we need to engage. We need to have a dialogue. And we need to have a discussion on, key humanitarian principles and a way forward. I can't predict that can bring success, but we need to include it. And we need to include Cuba in that discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. I'll give the floor to MP.
Only two small remarks on George Guzman's speech. First of all, don't forget inequalities are in the basis of a lot of crises in Latin America and not only Venezuela. Don't forget it, because we need to go to the root of the problem. And second, the impact of neighbors, especially in Colombia, and we need to support Colombia migration crisis in this situation, because if not, you are going to have two problems instead of one.
Thank you, MEP. Jorge, would you like to say something about this last intervention?
Yes, thank you. So yes, I completely agree with Grant regarding that. The Latin American countries and the European Union should include Cuba in this hypothetical conversation with Russia, China, and Iran. I would say that China and Russia has economic interests, also political interests, but if Venezuela being involved, of course, because at the end Venezuelans are who is going to resolve their situation with the support of the international community, Venezuelans can give some kind of tranquility to Russia and China regarding their economic investment in Venezuela. So at the end, first, the economic situation, the investments of the foreign countries that they already have with the Maduro regime, and then the political negotiation is going to be more complex, but I believe that that's going to be part of the solution. And I would like to address one of the questions regarding the influence of Venezuela in other Latin American countries. I believe it has decreased, and it has decreased because Venezuela is already a failed state, because there is no oil, there is no economic boom. And part of the strategy of the regime of Maduro was to influence Latin American countries by resources, with the oil resources, and Venezuela doesn't have those resources anymore. So I believe the influence has decreased dramatically. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you very much, Jorge. We will now hear last words from Ambassador Arria. I would like to ask you to be very brief, Ambassador, in this last intervention, because we ran out of time, happily for us. And I give you the floor without further ado.
Please unmute.
Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
The European Union members, of course, are against and condemn and punish drug trafficking. One thought, if that's the case, how could they maintain diplomatic relations with a narco criminal state that sends about 60% of the cocaine, according to the United Nations, that arrives in Europe is coming from Venezuela? And the second, about the question about the army, Venezuela is already an occupied country. Cuba has about 40,000 people in my country. It is what they call in the United Nations, the occupying power of Venezuela is Cuba. So the military are constrained, they are limited by the control that the Cuban government exercises on them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will now be closing up. To do so, we'll give the floor to Andrea Renda and Nelson Dordelli. Just a few words on my side as well. I'd like to say that me, as a Colombian living in Brussels, I feel very much enthusiastic to be part of these academic initiatives to discuss about Latin American affairs. Being here for about 2 years, I must say this is probably the first time that I see Latin American issues being addressed in such a way. So I feel really enthusiastic about this. I think those are very good initiatives that we must keep moving forward within CEPS. And well, thank you all very much for your attendance, for your participation, to our great speakers for their interventions. And Andrea, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Monica. I only have the time to thank everybody. I think we've heard many different views, not only convergence, and I think I'm very happy about this. There are also different ideas and different suggestions on how to tackle such a delicate and complex issue. The word diplomacy is always reminding the idea of compromise, even when the interlocutors are not necessarily the most easy to engage in the conversation, and the fact that Venezuelans, as has been reminded quite often, will need to try to find a solution by themselves to the destiny of their own country, obviously finds the limit of a process that is not conducive to democracy in and of itself. So I think the only thing that I can say in this respect is that we have collected questions, we have collected suggestions. We don't want to stop here. If you agree with us, we will keep this group with us. We want to continue this conversation because we consider this to be extremely fruitful, and perhaps some good ideas that can be then applied on field can come out of our exchange. And I think this is exactly what we want to do in this respect. So on behalf of CEPS, I am extremely grateful for all of you that with passion, including the attendees, have participated, have asked questions. We will keep home the questions that have not been fully tackled, and we would chase a little bit the speakers to make sure that maybe they find the time in the coming days to answer those questions, and maybe we will make a bridge with the ones that have asked the questions themselves. So again, muchas gracias a todos los ponentes. La palabra a Nelson.
Well, thank you very much. I know I have very, very, very limited time, so I want to say thank you to every one of you that participate in this event, and all the speakers and the participants as well. And I'm optimistic, actually. After listening to everyone, I'm optimistic. I think that the monster has been very clear, explain what it is, and it has been clear what is the path that we need to take now, even though it's a Venezuelan issue and we have to solve it. Venezuelans have to solve it, but now we've seen that the international community is clear that it's the European Union, Canada, and the rest of the world, from members of parliament, from academics, from different points of view, we're clear that we need to do something urgent to help the Venezuelan people. So I thank you for that, and I agree with Andrea. This must continue. We hope that this group continues, and this is not the end of this discussion. I think this is just the start of a discussion in terms of Venezuela and Latin American issues with the European Union and the rest of the world. Thank you so very much to everyone.
Thank you again for the invitation.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
It's good to continue to discuss not only on Venezuela, but other problems of Latin America. All this cooperation we are discussing at the end. Involving also European Bank of Investment.
For investments and many other issues, and of course on tackle the main issues of poverty, and of course drug cartels, and how we can stop drug cartels to influence in Europe. And there are many issues, but we definitely need to continue the discussions and bring it up to light here in Europe.
I'm available to continue in this group. Thank you very much for the invitation. Bye-bye, Andrea. Bye-bye, Nelson. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Hasta muy pronto.
Hasta pronto.
Monica.